Okay, so I want to start making videos about the horrors of the 90s in the post-Soviet countries. I've been thinking a lot lately about my experiences as a child, and it is a lot to process, actually. And probably there are works out there, the books that talk about some of the things that happened. But I was thinking about, more personal accounts. Like I shared before, like I know a lot of the people who were born in the Soviet Union and they're still alive, so I can talk to them and we can actually compare and contrast everything that's been happening for the past 30 years or so, the 30 years of independence. And let me tell you, it has been a freak show. It has been a freak show. And there are so many people that miss the Soviet Union. And of course, they're like, yeah, things were not perfect, but compared to what we have now, and it's the vast majority of the working class people. And also uniquely, I have talked to a lot of people who are the modern bourgeoisie here locally. It just so happens that I talk to a lot of those people. And of course, I don't get to talk much about the Soviet Union with them. And I don't really want to, right? Because they would probably not be very willing to talk about returning the means of production. But just through observing a lot of the things, I was able to come to a lot of conclusions. So I'm going to start sharing them. And it's a lot to unpack. There were so many things. If you've ever heard people from the former Soviet Union countries talk about how in every single family we had someone who died in the Great Patriotic War or the World War II. Now, I can probably make a different statement that is kind of similar about how every family had someone either die of suicide or die because of alcoholism or die of an overdose or have a mental health crisis that ultimately led to death, which would kind of correlate with suicide, but not always. Sometimes it would be accidents. So every single family in the 90s here in these lands, people would die from preventable things because the destruction of the government that cared about the people, the destruction of the infrastructure of all social safety nets has led, predictably, to a lot of death and a lot of destruction and a lot of pain and suffering. And obviously, I was a child in the 90s, so I didn't firsthand experience a lot of the struggles. However, I was a very observant child, and I would just study what was happening, and I kind of didn't know I didn't have any point of reference, right? And I didn't have anything to compare my experience to. So, but now I do. So the major thing I remember, the vibe, so to speak, was fear. I was afraid of everything as a child, and granted, I have CPTSD, but I probably do have a lot of my CPTSD because I was growing up in the 90s, and I was afraid of everything. And that was probably because the adults in my life also were afraid of everything because they didn't know how they would survive another day. I do remember very vividly, and it was kind of a funny occurrence, how we had those money, rubles. I will insert a picture somewhere here. And I would, when I was 4 and 5 years old, I would collect little pieces of money. And this is when the collapse actually happened, 1991, 1992. And I would collect those little bills and I wanted to buy things, right? And then all of a sudden, my parents were laughing about my little stash of little rubles because they told me that, oh, your money, this money has devalued so much that you can't buy anything with this money. And I remember, I didn't really know a lot about numbers and whatnot. I could count a little bit because I was 4 and 5 years old. But I remember just looking at this paper and thinking what? You told me it was money before. I could buy things with this before. And now you're telling me you can't? And I remember my parents just laughing as if it was funny. But then I also remember overhearing the adults speak about how what are we going to do? The money is meaningless now. People lost all the savings they had. And of course, as a child, I didn't really understand what it was all about. But what I could understand was fear. So yeah, and a lot of terrible things happened because of this. Some people committed suicide just because they felt so hopeless about the future. They felt like the future is going to be worse. And they were right. But the other things that I remember very vividly, how we would have those spontaneous markets just appear, people would just go out in the streets and sell things. And when I was a child, it didn't occur to me that it was kind of strange and unusual. And we still have a little bit of this today, and it happens in a lot of other places. I will try and insert like pictures. If you travel anywhere, you will see like in Europe, they do that. It's not like super unusual, but I just remember people would sell a whole bunch of stuff, which was kind of valuable, right? They would sell like family jewels and like regalia from the war and books that were like collectibles. And they would also sell like meaningless little stuff like children's toys and whatnot, but these objects still might have had sentimental value. So people were selling like everything because they didn't have any resources to survive, to sustain themselves, because a lot of the factories and plants and everything, the production just shut down. Nothing was working. Not nothing, but a lot of the places stopped working. So people didn't have a source of income. Some people received shares in their like plants and factories they worked at, but then others took advantage of them and they would like buy off those shares for cheap, because sometimes it would take like years for any kind of a plant or factory to do something about these shares. So some of those people who we called speculators, they would just like buy off all the shares from a plant or factory, and later they became incredibly rich because they basically became the owner. They had like most of the shares of a plant or a factory that used to be state owned. And this is how a lot of people got rich, just by, you know, speculation and by basically deceiving people and getting their shares. And this also goes to show how naive a lot of the people that were born and raised in the Soviet Union were, because they didn't really think much of it. They were like, well, I mean, what am I going to do with these shares? Like, is the plant going to start working? Is it not? Like, I need the money now, whatever. And they would just sell their shares in the plant, in the factory, for literally nothing. It really grinds my gears. Like, even my husband's family, that happened to them. I think his grandmother, she sold some of her shares in the factory, and then the person who she sold it to, she like talked to them and kind of kept in touch. And this person ended up becoming very rich off of other people's misery. But going back to the spontaneous markets that I was talking about, like I remember how they would sell all of these little trinkets, and they would sell exotic things as well, like bananas. I remember when I was a child, when I was 5 years old, this was the first time I tried bananas, and I was kind of happy about it. But later, I realized that it was probably like contraband. People would, from the stores, would just kind of like steal whatever they could, and then they would kind of sell it like in a different district so they wouldn't get caught, because it wasn't a period of complete unlawfulness, but it was pretty close. Like a lot of the laws were still not decided upon because the republic was new. If you guys didn't know that, Kazakhstan was the last country to exit the Soviet Union, and I kind of envisioned this as our, you know, representatives at the time. They were like, what do we do? What do we do? And like they didn't want to stop being a part of the Soviet Union. And like the whole referendum thing, you probably know, like people in the Soviet Union didn't want the collapse to happen. In Russia, they even attempted like a counter revolution, but it didn't really pan out. It didn't really amount to anything. If I find some resources, because I remember reading something about this in English, I will put the links down below. But it was a crazy time. It was a wild west in many regards. Most people were completely unprepared, and they didn't know what to do with this newfound freedom, because it wasn't freedom to do, you know, it wasn't freedom of opportunity. It was freedom to starve to death and to collapse. And some people actually did take advantage, as I mentioned before, of others, and they ended up becoming rich. And this is kind of the dream for many people nowadays in the capitalist world, where they hope to become lucky and become rich. But you've got to remember that when you become rich, it's always off of the back of someone else. You never become rich, honestly and ethically. That is just impossible. If you read even a little bit of Marx, you will see that becoming rich is only possible when there are poor, because these are the people you're going to exploit in order to make profit. And also, rich is the concept that only exists when there is no universal abundance. And universal abundance was always the goal of the Soviet Union, and as far as I know, is still the goal for the socialist projects that are still around today. But this idea of just becoming rich individually, this of course kind of worked for some people, but at what cost? And another very interesting thing that I remember is the gangs. The gangs became very, very abundant. We actually had stranger danger realness here, because people would participate in robberies, in murder, in all kinds of assault for resources. And some of those gangs would organize, and they would have leaders and become kind of mafia-like. And they would impose themselves onto businesses, and they would demand that businesses pay them for protection. And there are a lot of movies about the 90s that were predominantly made in Russia, which actually kind of show you the bleakness and the horror of the 90s in a lot of the post-Soviet places. And some of these movies, they're not even exaggerating. Like, people literally would murder each other in bright daylight for like literally nothing, for shoes. My husband grew up in the district that was kind of a ghetto district, and he shared with me that a lot of the people who he grew up with ended up becoming criminals or the police, which are the same things. And yeah, he told me about how as he was growing up, he would see those people just like go to prison, come out of prison, go to prison, come out of prison, and they just had that lifestyle, that criminal lifestyle. And a lot of the young people would start emulating that and form their own young youth gangs. And my husband also suffered. Like, he was beaten up pretty severely once. He ended up in the hospital, and they took his shoes. Like, that's all they stole. Yeah, this was a pretty gruesome story. He actually still has consequences, health consequences, because of the severe beating. And he was just like walking on the street, and it wasn't even late at night, and he was just assaulted out of nowhere. And that was very common. Like, all the people who grew up with him, who survived and who remained sane, they share very similar stories. Like, they would get beaten up very often for no reason or for economic reasons. So thankfully, I didn't experience any kind of violence like this. Yeah, it was very common for people in the 90s to experience violence. Rape as well was very, very, unfortunately prominent. Kidnapping and selling children into slavery. Sex trafficking as well was another huge trade during the 90s. So yeah, we really did grow up with actual stranger danger. Like, we were taught never to talk to anyone, to always just go back home from school, to never hang out. I mean, we still did that, right? We were children, we were teenagers, we didn't know better. And personally, I got lucky. Some people who I knew, not so lucky. Some people who I knew, they died due to various reasons. And I'm not going to share a lot of the stories because they are not mine to share. But yeah, I will definitely start telling more of these stories. I will probably just start writing them down, and maybe I'll publish them so that the people see just how terrible it was, the transition back to capitalism. Even though we didn't even have capitalism in Kazakhstan before the Soviets came. Before the Soviets came, we had freaking feudalism. So we didn't even have capitalism. So the emergence of capitalism in these lands really shows us how ineffective, gruesome, inhumane, and just stupid capitalist mode of production is. And now, unfortunately, I'm seeing a lot of the same things happen. Like, it feels like 90s.2, like crime is on the rise because of poverty. People do not have resources, so they resort to crime. And everything, all the infrastructure is so old, everything's falling apart. No one's really fixing it. Even if they fix it, it falls apart within a few years. All the new infrastructure is really kind of like, it really is a shot in the dark. You don't know what you're gonna get, even like apartments, houses wise. It's very unsafe. The job market is pretty horrendous. The wages are insane. And it's like all over the world, I know. So it's the cost of living crisis, and we're not exempt. But it really reminds me of the 90s. So I think we're going to see a rise in gang violence again, and other kinds of violent crime, just because of the terrible conditions that capitalism is bound to create. So yeah, let me know what you think of this new series that I want to start. Let me know of your own experiences if you were born in the Soviet Union, or if you know someone who was born in the Soviet Union. We need to spread this kind of knowledge so that people can learn the truth about capitalism and communism and the Soviet Union. So I hope you stay well and stay safe, and I'll talk to you sometime later.